Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the 2025 Critical Librarianship session hosted by Indigenous Programs at Deakin Library. We welcome Associate Professor Kirsten Thorpe, who is Worimi from the Port Stephens area of New South Wales, so north of Newcastle. I had to look that up. Kirsten is an Associate Professor and Chancellor's Indigenous Research Fellow at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney. Kirsten leads the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship Hub. She's also an invited member of the International Council of Archives Expert Group on Indigenous Matters, an elected member of the International Federation of Library Association and Institutions, Indigenous Matters Standing Committee, and a co-founder of the Indigenous Archives Collective. Kirsten is also an executive member of the Mayam Ngari Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective. Sorry, my apologies. So before I welcome Kirsten, we'll first do an acknowledgement of country.
Deakin University would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which our students and staff come together. As we learn, teach, innovate, and research through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the elders and ancestors who have cared for the country that you join us from. An ancient place where education, innovation, and knowledge transfer have taken place for many thousands of years. At Deakin, we aim to nurture and continue this important legacy whilst encouraging our communities to walk softly on country in the spirit of sustainability. In particular, we give gratitude to the elders and ancestors of Wadawurrung country, Wurundjeri country, and Eastern Maar country and beyond, where our physical campuses are located. Their contributions to our learning communities and environments are rich and highly valued. Deakin is committed to embedding Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in all disciplines that we teach, as well as advancing the self-determined interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including treaty and truth-telling. As you move around our physical and virtual environments, take a moment to consider, appreciate, and listen deeply to the country beneath your feet.
So before we start the session on Indigenous librarianship reforms in library practices to support Indigenous sovereignty and wellbeing, I'd just like to mention that the Critical Librarian sessions will be an annual offering. We don't have a date for it. It's just dependent on when we can get our guest speaker available. The reason why we provide this session is the library believes that offering these sessions is important for changing library practices. It also helps in the education space as well. So in 2023, we invited Emily Abell to start off the Critical Librarianship session, Agency and Action in the Library. In this session, Emily explored how positionality, power dynamics, and institutional values shape librarians' work and decisions. The discussion focused on recognising libraries' agency as social actors, considering matters of power and privilege, and taking action to promote critical librarianship across various library areas. Today, Kirsten will explore how Indigenous librarianship can pave the way for reforms in libraries and archives, enabling First Nations people to control their cultural heritage materials with dignity and respect. Drawing from Indigenous-led research in critical library and archival studies, the presentation will examine the importance of recognising Indigenous people's spiritual and emotional needs within the library and information settings, while addressing questions about redistributing power and dismantling dominant practices. So before I hand over to Kirsten, I just wanted to point out that Kirsten will give a about 30-minute presentation, and then we have a 25-minute section for discussion and Q&A. So as we've noted before, please put any questions into the Q&A rather than the regular chat. It's just a little bit easier to monitor that way. We will be recording this session and may provide access to it later after reviews and any necessary edits are completed. So I'll just hand over now to Kirsten. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining. Julie and I and the team were talking just before we came online. I'm just going to check that all looks okay with the presentation. Excellent. We were talking online about the opportunities still of, being able to have some of these conversations in a digital space. And I think sometimes it always feels weird for us all to be sitting at our desk or in our office. But I really appreciate, sharing this conversation with you. And I hope it's a conversation, and thanks to you for having a discussion later on about, I guess, the intersection between Indigenous librarianship and critical librarianship. So nice to see the acknowledgement of country and where Deakin is situated. I'm calling in from Darkinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales, and I want to similarly acknowledge the care and protection that the community here have led for millennia, the care of the animals, the bush that surrounds me, and also making this a beautiful place for me to live today. My family are Warramai from Port Stephens, as Tui said, and I really want to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present, and really, thank everyone for their work. I think sometimes I think the work of Indigenous people in these spaces is, we know that the field is and needs to grow, but people do a lot of work that I sort of consider as being warriors in that work, and I, especially in that context, want to acknowledge Tui for your work and the leadership that you have in academic libraries. I think they have a special place for me after spending a few years in there. I think for all of you that are joining from academic library context, I think that you have all of the space and potential to do some amazing things. So today, I guess I wanted Tui and I talked about this conversation a while back, and I think a lot about critical librarianship, critical archives, and the work that we have to do, as Tui has mentioned, of dismantling practices and working to support Indigenous self-determination. So I want to explore that a little bit today and think through some of those things about power and representation, but try and center that in this idea of, well, what is Indigenous librarianship and how can that potentially forge a bit of a pathway for us to enact that work. So I guess a couple of things just before we get into it, about language and words. When I talk about Indigenous libraries and archives, I really centre Indigenous knowledges, but also respectfully think of the functions that, a library does, an archive does. And so in this talk, I'll probably go between that library and archive space, recognizing that, at the core, our profession is there to steward, to provide access to information, and to do it in a way that supports that range of, abilities for people to learn and to have leisure, to care, and to curate, to enact knowledges and knowledge spaces in different ways. And sort of respecting that, filtering down from a lot of our work. We do particular things, but I really take that broad level of the work. I also, just as the obvious disclaimer, recognize the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. And so some of the things that I talk about, obviously, as a higher level, shared experiences, shared positions of sovereignty in different contexts, similar experiences of colonization. Those things are there, but also very different in different contexts. So I want to acknowledge that and really encourage you in the context of critical librarianship to think about that. And also, just as another note, I'm going to talk a little bit, since Joy and I were talking about this lecture, we've had the opportunity at Jump Under Research to do the libraries and the intersection with Indigenous knowledges talk. So I'm going to draw a little bit on some of the things that Lauren Booker and I were talking about in there for people who didn't attend, but as a refresher. And I was just thinking about that first sort of, in terms of this yarn, thinking about that idea sometimes in an Indigenous setting, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would kind of reflect on how a situation or an event made either themselves or as a worker, or they witness communities sort of feel sick from going into a library. And I think that's something that I want to start to explore at the end, you know, some definitions of Indigenous wellbeing and sovereignty, and how that might make a difference to making people feel really well when they come into our spaces. So I guess in terms of critical librarianship, it gives us the tools to think about power. I have to go back and listen to the first talk to it because I haven't seen that yet, but I'd love to. And my reading of critical librarianship is to start to bring those layers apart in front of us of the assumptions of, you know, some of our statements that, you know, we're institutions that provide access for all, you know, that we're neutral, and all those things are very important. You know, what we see internationally, the conversations about censorship, we know that we have to work from that premise that, you know, the people, the communities that come to access services, whether it be in a public library or an academic library, we have to treat people in that form of equality. But of course, we know that equality doesn't mean the same thing for everyone, and people have had different experiences. And particularly if we're thinking in an Indigenous context, we have so much that we haven't reckoned with in terms of our experiences of colonisation. So I guess for me today, in thinking about this talk, is really starting to think, well, what would the role that Indigenous librarianship would take in our view of thinking critically about library services? And in the people that haven't had a chance to look at the report that we did for Kaval, Alia, and Nesla, really started to think about this idea, and particularly internationally in the literature, to push for Indigenous people having a specific and unique relationship with the work that we do. And as Stratton and Carlson have said here, Indigenous people have distinct ways of knowing the world that are unique. Therefore, libraries and librarianships will be conceived differently when seen through the lens of an Indigenous worldview and ways of knowing. So we know in, you know, IFLA have done a special issue, really encourage people to go and have a look, that there's been some of this conceptualization around what Indigenous librarianship would look like. And I think one of our challenges, and when we have these conversations, is thinking about how we straddle the critical librarianship mandate to look at power, but also at the same time straddle this view for other ways and recognition of other ways of knowing. And I think sometimes we kind of get caught up in that bind. We're trying to do the dismantling while also rebuilding to support Indigenous ways of knowing. So one of the definitions, and for people who have looked into this space, was done, you know, when we look back in 2009 by Burns and colleagues, talking about how Indigenous librarianship is about a knowledge base, a theory, and a research methodology. And what I hope from my conversation today is that can get you all thinking about the thinking and the questions that you want to engage with in a critical space with Indigenous library work, rather than always the doing, and start to think about those questions of standpoint, lens, participation, and maybe in that view, doing a bit of unlearning. So back to the definition for Burns and colleagues, what I really love about their work is thinking about Indigenous librarianship being that culturally relevant provision of services that isn't just about this dichotomy between traditional and contemporary, but is grounded in the experiences of community now. So taking them contemporary realities, but also looking at these aspirations in terms of self-governance and sovereignty, and that is the basis for action. And I think that's really critical, and something maybe in our discussion, Tui, that we can talk about. I think, you know, reflecting again that this is in 2009, what we see overseas is a really fantastic body of work around this. People like Sandy Littletree acknowledging Sandy's work, really starting to look at what the models would be like to enact this. But I think still to point out that this is an emerging field of practice, and one that is still evolving. So I wanted to turn a little bit just in the conversation to contextualize the work that we're doing at Jumbunna. Our team, myself, Dr. Lauren Booker and Dr. Monica Kalassi, after having experience working in different library archive settings, working with community to pull apart and I guess open up spaces of engagement. That was a lot of my roles, thinking about protocols, have really come now to research to again step back and start to think in the vein of critical librarianship. What are the questions that we're actually looking to analyze, to examine? Who participates in some of that thinking, and who do the outcomes benefit? And I'll come back to that a little bit throughout the talk. And I think that work that we do in our particular hub, the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship Hub, really cements the work of Jumbunna, and acknowledging, obviously, Deakin leading this work, that, all of the Indigenous research institutes around the country are looking at how research can benefit, and those that are Indigenous-led are looking to how research can support Indigenous communities. And what that means for us at Jumbunna is thinking through questions of sovereignty and self-determination, but actually, getting that sense from different communities. What are the things that are a priority for you? And what we hope to do in our work is bring that Indigenous research paradigm into the library and archive spaces. And, I think in Australia, we don't have enough research that's happening in here. And I think a lot of people are tackling really, really complex work on the ground. And I think it's incredibly important that that work is taking place, but also that people document that and start to sort of bring this body of knowledge forward in the space of Indigenous librarianship. But I guess an Indigenous research paradigm and thinking about critical librarianship and the intersection with Indigenous librarianship really brings for us some basic ethical practices. And for those of you who know about the IATSIS research code, and for others who haven't, there are some really fantastic models that get us thinking about ways that we, in different disciplinary contexts, can think about and resist really extractive practices. And my observation of the library field is often we're sort of looking to do good. We're looking to increase access, but some of these fundamental sort of structures aren't necessarily always in place. And so people start to act without getting that groundwork done right. And for those of you that want to do more reading and thinking about it, and for other First Nations people who are on the call, thinking all the time about, what does respect, what does reciprocity, what does relationality mean, and relational accountability. And what does that mean if you're working with a community that makes decisions communally, that there's a different kind of flow of cultural knowledge, participation. And if you don't have that lens and you can't see it, then it's really hard, I believe, for a library to be building the right programs and services to support that work. Tui talked in the introduction as well about how we in the library archive information sector think about things like spiritual and emotional care, and an Indigenous research paradigm really helps us to think about that view. And for those of you that know the research of Sean Wilson, really love his work. And I think it happens in the participation between First Nations library archive workers now is that we all work together in a way that our knowledge is relational. And, obviously working in a community context, that's some of the things that are just held to be so important, that in his view there, that knowledge isn't individual and it's not something to be gained, but instead it's embracing this knowledge that that understanding that knowledge is created through relationships. And that's just not person to person, but it's actually relationships with country and relationships with the land and people's ancestors. So I think that in the context of critical librarianship, for us to forge agendas in an Indigenous research space, we have to think about these paradigms. I really like, for those of you who are, keeping up to date with reading, the Journal of Critical Library Studies, Michelle Caswell and colleagues have also looked at the space of what critical archival research and practice is about and what critical archive studies is. And I like this definition because it helps us to sort of peel back those assumptions of what's unjust about the current work. It's sometimes we have those views of there's pieces of work that sit in our functions, whether it's an access question, a description question, an engagement question. But I think in the same way, in the critical librarianship, it's bringing that social justice lens to say, well, what is unjust? For those of you who are the metadata people, working in the reparative description space, what are the words that are being passed around in our not just our systems that describe information, but that are colonial constructs, the discovery. I always see that as an example of, the explorer. There's lots of words that I think sit in front of us that if you start to think about what is unjust, is really helpful. In their view as well, it's also thinking about that intersections between research and practice. And I don't think when people talk about research, and for me now, being fully in an academic research role, research isn't just about someone having their doctorate. It's not about it being a privileged space, although, acknowledging in that critical theoretical perspective that academic research has privilege and has been used as a tool of oppression as well. But thinking, what can you do in your job as well to bring a research lens? How do you actually plan your projects in a way that you evaluate them, that you appropriately frame the work and consider the people that are involved? So I think we've got some really wonderfully forming models of critique that give us this ability to move between research and practice. For us at Jumbana, I've just put on screen, there's some links to some of the things that we're doing, but we're really thinking at the moment about how the incredible movement that is upon us with Indigenous data sovereignty, and Tui mentioned, I've just recently joined Mayim Ngari Wingara and acknowledging the work that people have forged for the last decade with that. Thinking, how does that assertion of sovereignty, the assertion that we see in the United Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, how does that actually come into an Indigenous archive and library space? And how do we, I guess, catch up on this work that we have to do retrospectively? And in my work, I conceive this very much around the harms and dangers that are right in front of us, but also how do we move into this space? You can see in the smaller diagram on the right, how do we shift into a space that supports well-being? And so I guess in my mind, that's really for us to all think, we've got this catch-up work to do, but that catch-up work also has to inform the paradigms that we work in the future. And we have a real challenge, I guess, in our sector, the scale of collections, information systems, our workforce compared to, the needs that communities are expressing. So for me, data sovereignty is a really important place for us to actually refine and focus on those questions that go back to the core of our work at Jumbana. What do community want, and how do we know that, and how do we find that out? So when Lauren and I did the talk about for Alia and Call, and we were so pleased to have that opportunity just to have these conversations. These were some of the core things that people said to us in the dialogue sessions. about, what is Indigenous librarianship? So, that intertwining, as I've mentioned, around Indigenous methodologies and methods, having country as central, and respecting the flow of Indigenous knowledge systems. The real need, I think, for us in Australia to also think about Indigenous design, Indigenous-led design of library building and spaces. We really, I think we fall behind incredibly for our colleagues internationally, thinking about what is a learning space and how do people participate in physical and digital spaces. I think that, again, if we would take that critical lens and think about what is unjust, we need to also consider learning styles and participation, and consider how we might rebuild them. Talked a little bit already about Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance, but I guess, for us thinking about Indigenous librarianship, Indigenous data governance means that communities are sovereign people and they make decisions about their knowledge through that position of sovereignty. And so it's not a paradigm of we want to work with you or we want to engage with you, but governance requires decision making. And so I think we have a lot of opportunities in Indigenous librarianship to be thinking about agreement making, and obviously all the work that's happening through the leadership of Dr. Terry Jenke with ISIP work really shows us that we can do this stuff, but it doesn't just have to be about intangible cultural heritage. It can be about knowledges, in the full assertion of our rights. So lots to think about in terms of Indigenous librarianship. Again, really encourage people to go and read. One of the things that I wanted to say that we see internationally with this work is as well that Indigenous librarianship, of course, needs to be led by, conceived by Indigenous people, but it's actually in its fullest form a space for allies, for all workers to participate in. And what it means is opening up a really generous space for people to contribute to the agenda. And I think maybe, Tui, there's some things that we can talk about at the end that touch on that. We know that this work, we know our workforce needs to grow. And I really believe if we have Indigenous librarianship as a backbone of that, we will see the sector grow. But I think we don't want to do this alone. We want to see, every academic library, every public library, every collecting institution, I guess, instill some of these values in the work. So for me, thinking about, this question of redistributing power, I mentioned that before. If we're starting to think about how we focus on a position of care, and for me, care is about, we all see words differently, but care is fundamentally about that alignment with well-being and making sure that my comment about people not feeling sick, I think that that's an extreme measure of a risk in a situation, but one that we have to come to terms with. I don't see care in a way that Indigenous people are problems that need to be fixed, but actually thinking about people experiencing, learning and engaging with libraries, archives, information in a way that they feel good, or that their learning and their participation is nourishing and connected. And I think the notion of reciprocal relationships really helps us in that way. And if people are thinking about those that might do user experience in a library, we know those visual cues are really important. The symbolism of acknowledgement of country when people walk through areas, but also going into that critical lens of who does the collection represent and how can you bolster that. And I think academic libraries really lead the way. I last week was away in a regional area, and I'm always sort of surprised when I'm delighted, I guess, when I see a public library having visual cues of, you know, whose country, who are the traditional owners. But I'm also really saddened when I go into a library and I see that there really is nothing to represent our long, amazing history, and see that as such a missed opportunity for libraries not to centre and not to learn from that history. So I guess on screen there are a few things that I think about the redistribution of power and the way that we can start to think about care. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People should inform fundamentally the work that we do in libraries and in archives. And again, to get us back to that data sovereignty view, what we want to do is engage with Indigenous people as sovereign peoples. And so for library operations, for me, that means first and foremost that obligation to the community whose the area that your library is standing on. You know, what's your engagement and negotiations about mutual benefit in that space, but also for other people who, you know, might be engaging in services with you, what does that look like? Talked a little bit about those harms and dangers, but to really understand, you know, we've just had, you know, a major election again. You know, we see every time we get into a situation of a change of government, really contentious issues coming up that situate us in a paradigm that we are still in a colonial project, or people want to pull us into a colonial project. So while some people might think that that's a political thing that's happening outside, to just think all the time, how is your library participating in a way that can take that deep Indigenous lens that is fundamentally driven by respect for community, respect for land, a real embracing of Indigenous ways of knowing, compared to this pull into a colonial paradigm. And so much that we see tied up with that is, you know, our absolute need, if we're thinking about power relationships, to resist those assumptions around stereotypes and racism, and fundamentally think about that question of self-determination and care for country. And I think to adjust your, you know, the acknowledgement of country at the beginning, if people take the time to actually think, well, I do that at home here. What are the birds that are coming in? If I plant new trees, who's coming back here? There's so much more that can support all of us in our learning and understanding if we just open up the blindfold, I guess, to see some of that stuff. For libraries and archives, as I kind of wind up what I wanted to talk about, I've been a critic of the cultural safety dialogue. I know it's really important, and it's not to discount the view of cultural safety, and I think it's a necessary term. But I think for me, our focus on Indigenous wellbeing puts us in a better place to think about how wellbeing is sort of wrapped up in social, emotional, and cultural health. And for us, you know, for the library leaders who are on the call or who might listen to this, you know, what would a KPI look like on a library plan to say, well, how does our library work with, you know, not suggesting that your library will have health needs in this way, but do you have measures or indicators that can actually look at, you know, well, if people are participating in our programs, you know, how are we supporting wellbeing? And it might be that you engage with other sectors to ask some of those questions. So I've done a little bit of work thinking about what Indigenous wellbeing looks like in the archives, thinking holistically about, you know, the support that we all have in front of us in terms of our work, supporting Indigenous worldviews and lifeways and cultural needs in the information space, and thinking again about how those protocols really intersect with governance and decision making. I have a real sort of passion, and I don't know if passion's the right word actually, but I guess in my thinking around the paradigm shift, I also think, you know, we have to pull ourselves into a position that we really seriously address the impacts of colonization and the legacies that still flow through. We have to commit to truth telling, and truth telling isn't about the content of our collections, and people, I think, are misguided by that. We have historians, we have filmmakers, we have people to enact and tell the stories of those events. I think the truth telling that has to come in our sector is about how our systems and processes have helped support those colonial structures. We sort of remove ourselves part way. We say we need to repair description, but we aren't having the reckoning that we need to have. And really, in my heart, in terms of the work that I think we need to work towards, is thinking about sovereignty and the care of material, and what does it mean to have different agreements with communities through data sovereignty paradigms to support Indigenous archives on country, and to support this work in a way that suits communities. We sort of work in either our online systems. Everyone comes to a library, everyone comes to an institution or a space, but what would happen if we actually had more of a reciprocal flow through there? So lots to think about. I think with the reforms, I won't go into these, but I think there's just so much that we have to think more holistically about our priorities, and we need to start to build some lenses around how these things operate together. So if we think about the second one there, archives as a place of sorry business for those institutions who have collections that document historical moments that communities would conceive as being related to sorry business, so death, mourning, grief, holistically, in the way that the community engages with that. How would we do our work differently? And what responsibilities would we have day to day to make sure that people had the right approach? And thinking through again to, how do we centre and return love to ancestors? How do we sort of move the repair into a space that actually gives community members dignity? And I think, in my view, the only way we do that is to engage more fully with community, so that they have the right of reply, so that they can participate. And I know a lot of our questions, and Tui, as we start to talk about them in a moment, is how do we do this? I think we've got tools in front of us, ALIA, and recognising the ALIA, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Expert Working Group. We've got tools there. We've got this new space of looking at active professionalism and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contexts. We just have to embed ourselves in that learning, and really thinking again about, if you have a desire to work with community, are you working through a frame of mutual benefit, or are you actually continuing extractive practices? I think just in the last slide here that I'll finish with too is just thinking about if critical librarianship really gives us the ability to start to think, and for those of you here, you must be committed to thinking about how does power and privilege operate in your context, and it gets us to think about and challenge those systems of power. But I guess what I'd like to leave with and maybe talk about a little bit more is to think about, well, how does Indigenous librarianship give us an alternative and a pathway for us to really start to think about both the need to transform, and we know in order to transform, we're going to have to pull some stuff apart, we're going to have to disrupt, but we're also at the same time going to have to build this really nurturing space to bring Indigenous ethics and principles into our work, and to think about respect, reciprocity, and relationality, can't get that one out, and mutual benefit in our work. So I know a lot to think about, but I guess my message is we've got the push and the pull of, our past and future, and it's going to take a lot of us to sit back and reflect and think, well, yeah, how do we do our business? So I might stop talking now and Tui, hand over to you for a discussion and any questions that people might have. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. What I found really interesting about your talk was the bits where you talked about the colonial mindset. And I think for a lot of people, they may not understand what that means. And I'll use a quick example and then see if you can, I don't know, throw me something. So the colonial mindset is when you, as a classic example, probably used it online before. It's a little library in Western Australia in Leonora, a community resource centre, where Indigenous people were not using the resources at all, refused to come because of the way that the government had set up that service. They said that they had to wear shoes to go into the library. And the new librarian came in and bought a whole bunch of these shoes that were like, 50 cents for a pair of shoes. And the next thing you know, they have the most amazing amount of engagement. So it's that change of the mindset about this is how we always do things. So I wondering if you could sort of talk through a little bit about what that looks like, because obviously, research institutions are obviously a bigger beast than a smaller sort of library. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's on so many levels too, Ian. If I think back to, the late 1990s when I, first started working in libraries and archives, and I always remember if community members came to participate, they'd often wait at the front door until I went out and said, come in, come in, I'll show you, like I'll take you around and I'll give you a sense. And I think that's just a really simple example of relationality. And it's like, okay, I'm not sure when I come in. And again, this needs to be tested in terms of assumptions, but I think that on a scale, those kind of things can be talked about. What do people know about my library service? The building, how you get in. If we've had, a history of distrust and a history of, maybe the one person in a family or a couple of people in the community who've really, found themselves in a library space or an Indigenous education, centre that builds those relationships with libraries, then I think we've got to find the ways to participate and also just be really aware that sometimes things that seem kind of, and they wouldn't be a big deal to people if it's been around in your I don't know, some of those words, like I was even saying before, like discover, capture, like there's so many things that have become, I could probably, if I was more on fire today, think of that list of, encourage you to think about the unjustness of stuff, that those things can be triggers for people. And, we've got the field around trauma-informed library and archive practice, understanding that in some cases that might not mean anything, but in others you have to be tuned into that. I think it's really important. And your example, Tui, of just being able to accommodate a different way of doing stuff is really important. I know when I worked in practice, the ability for reading rooms, I think there's such a view of this textual experience, like sit down and read. And what happens if you learn through laughing and singing and, so do we have spaces that can happen? When I was at the State Library of New South Wales, the thought that, a community could come in and do that in the Mitchell reading room was to some people terrifying. So what's the alternative space for people to engage, I think is a really critical question.
Thanks. Before I move on to a question that has come in from Yasmin, that leads really nice into talking about archives as living archives. And I think we often forget that in a library that the use case for different communities is quite different. Can you just unpack that a bit more for people that don't understand what a living archive might look like?
Yeah, I think it is to me at the core about that relationality. And so and relational accountability, because there's sort of an assumption, I guess, when something takes a particular form, it's in a journal article, it's, written down in a book, that people participated, in free, prior, informed consent. And obviously, we would hope that our processes are rigorous enough and ethical enough that happens. But I guess that idea that the question of ownership and control and use and reuse are very, in our Western paradigm, it is sort of, our legal constructs kind of work on that. Well, it's done and now it will become this. And I think a living archive opens us up to think not about things not being recorded in ways that, if you think about the work that local context is doing with the traditional knowledge labels and licenses, there's constructs around that help things be fixed and help things be recorded. But there's not an assumption that people can just keep taking and extracting, that there's a view for that ongoing participation in whatever level that it needs to be. And I mean, I don't know for you two, but I feel like it's that thing, if the governance is there and you get things right, then things can move quicker. And so it's really important for us to think about that relationality. So for example, you just looking at the amazing artwork that you have here. So you engage a community member to, have artwork to tell a story in the library, but you also talk about, well, if we did this talk internationally, would it be okay that I shared your slides, and what kind of extra information? So you're talking about information in a way that you didn't just transactionally engage with that community to take stuff, but you honoured the knowledge that was being transmitted through there. I think just in the research data management space as well, and thinking about the care principles, there's just so much about, us not thinking that the ownership is with our institutions or our academics, but the ownership is with community. And how do we not just ensure that communities have, for example, research data from a project, but that they own that from the get-go.
I agree, and that's very in line with the right of reply and the right to know. And I think a lot of people don't understand with a living archive the right of reply and what that looks like, and then reuse. So I think that's actually quite important. We've got a question that comes from Yasmin, so just shifting a gear, on the cultural safety wellbeing question and what KPIs would look like with library spaces and collections. Could this be possible to begin with leveraging the psychosocial hazards within the National Work Health and Safety Guidelines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some of them conversations about I've seen some universities having additional remuneration for cultural load. So people have to understand when you hear the word cultural load, what is that? And so you have to, again, in this critical lens, see that that's people staying up really late of a night because all these extra people have asked them, hey, can you just tell me about, or can you sit on this committee, or oh, this person's concerned about this. Like, what is cultural load, first of all? But we've seen, to your point, the universities have started to recognise that additional work that people might take on, the cultural responsibilities in terms of just making sure that people are out and about and hearing what's happening, getting the lay of the land. And I think, earlier around the time of the Voice to Parliament did a really great piece of work that I'm not sure for anyone who's here from ALIA if it has been shared, but a really great piece of work around like a risk register and risk mitigation and what it would look like. So I think those markers are really important, and it helps us sort of look at the things that would indicate the risk or harm and to really effectively management. I think, all the work, health and safety, we know if you have a extension cord out and someone trips over it, that it's a hazard. And I think we need to just get really much more nuanced and focused on, well, what are the hazards that sit there for, particularly for First Nations workers. A lot of people talk to me in a research context about, it'd be great to do research on why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people leave the sector, why they didn't like their job. That's a hard piece of research for multiple reasons, but I think it also is an area that we need to think about for us to nurture this space of critical librarianship.
I think what's interesting there is you said cultural load, and I think that we're shifting towards saying colonial load because it's our cultural obligations and responsibilities, which we're happy to do. But I think the colonial load bit is the bit that we really struggle with in the library sector as Indigenous people. And then as far as trying to get that into work health and safety guidelines, so this is where it gets interesting. So if you suffer as an Indigenous person at work because of the role that you are in, then you come under the WHS guidelines. So you are protected under work cover or whatever it's called. But there's nothing within the provisions that talks about the cultural, the responsibilities of institutions to consider colonial load. So it's this very catch-22 situation. So I think that's really interesting. To kick it up another gear, and I knew someone was going to ask this, I don't know if you can actually talk about any of the research in relation to iReal in relation to AI.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that we can, through the networks, organise another session to feedback the results. I had a call last night with Sam, who was at the King's Digital Lab, and I guess one of our biggest insights from the project is in order for us to think about management of Indigenous knowledges in libraries and in AI, we have to have community leading that, and that's really difficult with our data. I think the data in the shape that it's in, we have to think about Indigenous data governance in different ways. I think the other thing that we learned is that it was just so important for iReal to build the literacy around, when we say artificial intelligence, what is it and how do we bring communities on board to do that? And I think for all of us, we have to do it. And the third thing with iReal was just as we started to prepare data for testing in the digital lab, was that the preparation work hadn't been done because often what we see in so many of our library contexts is people are worried about how things were ingested or what the controls were for this kind of reuse. So we sort of had to step back from that. But we will share sort of more research outputs from that and publish. So yeah, keep an eye out for it. It was a fun experiment and something that we hope to continue.
Thank you. As someone who got to sort of play around for that project, was just invited in for a session, I found it be quite eye-opening, and it's definitely informed some of the ways that I look at and use AI myself. We've got a question here in relation to trauma-informed practices. Can you expand on what this means for libraries and librarians?
Yeah, I mean, I'd point you to the Healing Foundation as real leaders for this kind of work. I'm always really, again, delighted when I see the leadership of someone like the Healing Foundation having resources, for example, for dentists and healthcare workers to think about trauma-informed work. So I guess, at the core, if you go and look at that literature, it's about giving people agency, not treating people as a problem, but understanding that context in which people would operate. And I think, in the stolen generation survivor context, it's understanding those ideas like the trauma triggers. So, while we might think of a library as a neutral space, what role have institutional structures played in the life of a younger person who was removed from family, and how is that then shared and I guess not handed down, but how are descendants impacted from them. So it's a real, I guess it's an opening to think and recognize that trauma, there's a potential for trauma, and I guess it goes back to our well-being. And thanks to you for the the thinking around the cultural and colonial load. It gets us into that frame. So I guess it's for all of us, and my words around the planning and evaluation is to be able to nut out what you know before you go to it. So it's recognizing that business might not be from start to finish. There might be other things that are happening when you go to it. So I'd go to the Healing Foundation for resources.
One other thing I'd add there, and I hadn't really thought about it in this context, and I've had to answer this question as part of a research project, is also vicarious trauma. And
Yep.
so as an Indigenous person, we hear this stuff all the time and we digest it and we're part of it. I often forget that when I just blurt things out, it can be quite traumatic for people who don't know this history about Australia. And so I might have just said, oh, I've got brothers and sisters that are stolen, and people just, we're so used to saying it and sort of verbalizing it. But the vicarious trauma, what does it look like for your library and archive when you've got these people working in spaces who aren't Indigenous, that don't know the background history? So I think that's also a really important point that we sometimes forget about. And also in relation to trauma for Indigenous people, the level of services that we require is so different. The kind of help that I need if I'm struggling with something at work is very, very different to the standard services that if I would employee assistance program can provide me. And so it has to be catered to our needs, because we just can't deal with it in the mainstream sort of way. We've got a couple more questions here. Oh, this is always a big one. What practical requests can we make to our leaders within the higher education sector to support growing the workforce of Indigenous librarians in Australia? And I know you've mentioned it briefly in your talk, but I mean, are there any sort of, I guess, practical sort of strategies in relation to that?
Yeah, I mean, every university would have, for us at UTS, we have an Indigenous education and research strategy. Wouldn't it be amazing to see, for the library to see, how do you, how are you a pillar in that? I'm just getting call. How are you a pillar in that work? For those decision-making kind of things, what is the research data management support? What's the publishing angles? What's the student engagement? I think that's really critical. But I think I'm really struggling at the moment and thinking through a lot how do we do this in a way that really pushes that agenda of self-determination? And so that's really nuanced, I think, in the workplace, of leadership kind of recognizing the need for resourcing, but doing the work to understand what the resources are for, and who will actually benefit from those resources. And I think my observation is that a lot of places haven't done that pre-work to say, because they haven't worked with the Indigenous centres to say, what could we do? And I think, again, internationally, having the Indigenous liaison librarians, having people that really support the discipline is critical. So there's a lot that we've got to do. And I don't know, I'm a skeptic sometimes when people are saying do stuff and get it wrong. I think there's enough work out there for people to plan effectively and to do this right. And again, credit to your leadership and to Deakin, to have a role where you aren't brought in as a fixer, but actually leading transformative work. I think people need to be, and I just saw Leslie Akers on the Q&A as well, and recognising the work at Uni of Queensland. Like, when people talk about good stuff happening, it's because leadership enabled that space to nourish as well.
Thanks. And just one quick one, which is obviously important. Is there any advice you'd give to First Nation mob considering starting their librarian studies?
Yeah, I think obviously being a part of the network is really important. Having that toolkit behind you is really critical. There's, where we work in an information space, but we're not very good at remembering things like, the ANZSA protocols. The ANZSA protocols, how are they? They've been around since 1995. It's 30 years. Take those tools and, use them to empower, but also, let leadership, if you end up in a role or you're doing courses and it isn't fit for purpose, then, draw on the strength of, all of the people who have been before you to say, actually, I want to do things a little bit differently. And that's really hard, but I think it makes a difference.
Thank you. So that's brought us sort of a couple of minutes over time. I just want to mention, anyone who's still here, there's a couple of links within the chat that I recommend you go and have a look at, especially one that Leslie Akers has put in there in relation to trauma-informed approaches to managing archives, quite important document. Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was amazing. As someone who's recruited an Indigenous librarianship cadet, Kalina, who's on the line in the background, it's been an incredibly important space, and I mentioned this before. We got talking about this over a trip in Qantas Lounge somewhere, and I hadn't really even heard that term before, even though we work in this space. And it's really nice that we actually have the terminology Indigenous librarianship, so we can actually look at the spaces and actually recruit into these areas. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.